So there are a lot of things that are misunderstood about psychology by the general public. Things like we only use 10% of our brain, or that a preferred learning style is a person's best learning style. Well, today we're going to visit one of the other things that is most often misunderstood by the general public about psychology, and that is negative reinforcement. So we're going to take a deep dive into negative reinforcement here today, and we're going to set the record straight. Hi, I'm Dr. Igor Juricevic, and this is Functional Analysis of Behavior 1. Let's go. All right, so this is the second of our Halloween-themed videos, so enjoy the spooky ambiance as we delve into negative reinforcement. So before we begin with negative reinforcement, I'm just going to remind you very briefly what positive reinforcement was. That was covered in our previous video, so again, if you haven't seen that video yet, I suggest you pause this video and go back and check it out. Otherwise, just a reminder that positive reinforcement occurs when a response, when a behavior is followed by the presentation of a stimulus change that increases the future occurrence of similar responses or behaviors. So that behavior is followed by a presentation. That makes it positive. Something is added to the environment. That's the positive part of positive reinforcement. And the future occurrence increases of that behavior, and that increases the reinforcement part of positive reinforcement. So today we're going to take a look at negative reinforcement. And as Cooper, Heron, and Heward mentioned, negative reinforcement contingency is one in which the occurrence of a response produces the termination, reduction, postponement, or avoidance of a stimulus, which leads to an increase in the future occurrence of that response. So let's talk about the reinforcement part of this definition first. Reinforcement leads to an increase in the future occurrence of a response. So the fact that in negative reinforcement, the behavior that leads to the contingency, the behavior that leads to the consequence increases in the future, that's what makes it reinforcement. What makes it negative, and I want to be very, very clear about this, what makes it negative is that the consequence removes something from the person's environment. So the consequence produces a termination. Something is stopped. Something is taken away from the environment. The consequence might be a reduction. Something is reduced. Something is taken away. The consequence is a postponement. The consequence is an avoidance. Basically, the consequence is something is taken away from the environment. That takeaway is the negative part of negative reinforcement. So I just want to be very, very clear about that. This is still reinforcement. It's just that now the consequence of the behavior is that something is removed from a person's environment. All right, so we're going to take a deeper look at negative reinforcement by taking a look at the four-term contingency illustrating negative reinforcement. So let's bring in the hand of fate. All right, and we're going to talk about the four terms in the contingency for illustrating negative reinforcement. Now, this four-term contingency is common to all reinforcement and all contingencies. So positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, negative punishment, all of them have these four-term contingencies. So this is the video where we're going to take a deeper look at that four-term contingency. So let's start off with the first term, which is the establishing operation. And the establishing operation is that antecedent event in whose presence escape would be reinforcing. So it is the event, it is what is going on in the environment where escape of that thing would be reinforcing. That is the establishing operation. Next, we have the discriminative stimulus. The discriminative stimulus is another antecedent event, that is, it takes place before the behavior, in whose presence a response is more likely to be reinforced. So it's a signal that reinforcement is more likely when that discriminative stimulus is present. Then we have the response. The response is the behavior that produces reinforcement, and then that is followed by the reinforcer. And in this case, the reinforcer is the termination, the taking away of, the negating the event that served as the establishing operation. So the establishing operation is a stimulus or an event where escape would be reinforcing, and the reinforcer is the actual termination or escape from that establishing operation. All right, so let's take a look at an example of this that might occur in the real world. So this is an example of negative reinforcement. So let's begin with the establishing operation, that antecedent event in whose presence escape is reinforcing. And in this case, it's a loud noise coming from construction outside. So if you're living in an apartment building and there is loud construction occurring outside, escaping from that loud noise would be something that you would find reinforcing. Escaping from that loud noise would be a goal that you have. Getting rid of that loud noise would be reinforcing. That is the establishing operation. If the loud noise did not exist, if the construction wasn't going on, you would have nothing to escape from. There would be no establishing operation to drive this negative reinforcement. So the establishing operation in this case would be the loud noise coming from the construction outside. The discriminative stimulus would be an antecedent event in whose presence a response is more likely to be reinforced. So in this case, that antecedent event would be that you see that your roommate is near the window. And you know that if your roommate is near the window, your behavior of asking them to close the window is more likely to be reinforced. If they're farther away from the window, chances are they're not going to get up and close the window for you, but they're right there next to the window. That's a discriminative stimulus, roommate near a window, in which case, if you ask them to close the window and they're not jerks, the response is more likely to be reinforced. Next, we have the response. The response in this case would be the actual request, the actual verbal behavior of saying, hey, can you close that window, please? And then the reinforcer would be the noise being subsided. So the noise subsides because the window is closed. And once that window is closed, that terminates the event that served as the establishing operation, which was a loud construction noise. So there's an example of that four-term contingency illustrating negative reinforcement in a real-world example: establishing operation, loud noise from construction; discriminative stimulus, your roommate is near the window; the response, can you please close that window; and the reinforcer, the window closed and the noise subsides. And what this does is it increases the probability that the next time there's construction noise outside and you see your roommate close to the window, you are going to ask them to close that window. It increases the probability of that future occurrence of saying, hey, can you please close that window? All right, now before we go, this is a personal pet peeve of mine, and this is going to be my public service announcement in service of expanding knowledge of psychology out into the general population. So this is just a reminder that negative reinforcement is not positive punishment. So we covered this in an earlier video, and I'm just going to hit on it again because this is probably the most widely held myth, or the most widely held error in terms of the general public's thinking about psychology. So negative reinforcement is not positive punishment. People often say, well, I would never spank my child because I do not believe in negative reinforcement. I would never scold my child because I do not believe in negative reinforcement. As we just saw, spanking and scolding is the addition of something to a person's environment. It's the addition of something to a person's situation. So it's actually a positive contingency, whereas a negative contingency is the removal of something from a person's environment. So to say that you don't spank your child because you don't believe in negative reinforcement is completely incorrect. And we need to be very, very clear on that, because when you learn about negative reinforcement, as the psychologists define negative reinforcement, just be aware that you are going to be constantly bombarded with people in the real world getting it wrong. So you got to stand by that river and you got to hold fast and you got to say, the world is telling me to move on this, but no, I'm standing firm. You move. Negative reinforcement is not positive punishment. All right, so that was my look at the four contingencies of negative reinforcement, our introduction to negative reinforcement, and my personal public service announcement. Some may call it a rant on negative reinforcement is not positive punishment. So that is it for today. So next time, we're going to take another look at negative reinforcement, specifically escape and avoidance contingencies in negative reinforcement. So thank you so much for joining me. I will see you next time. But until then, stay frosty, stay functional. All right, so this is the second of our special Halloween themed episodes. So, welcome to the horror show. I invite you to join me as we go through this. Oh my gosh. Elvira is a talented person.